Good evening, everybody. It's evening here. I don't know what time it is where you are. My name is Mark Davey. I'm a member of ASSAP, and I'm one of the trainers, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar that we're running this evening. It's the first of our webinars. We're going to be running more of these, and I think we're all getting used to working online. Certainly I have. I've been running lessons during the daytime for the last 3 months, so just about getting used to it. But Zoom is something I'm not so familiar with, so just bear with me this evening whilst I make my way around the controls. So I'm going to be introducing to you one of our members. CJ is our secretary, and he's going to be doing a discussion tonight about the theory of ghosts. Normally at this point, we'll be talking about some news, and we'll be giving you an update in some of the other things that we're planning. This is the first of our webinars. Please give us some feedback. Let us know how it's gone afterwards. Also, we may have some news at some stage around some of the conferences. Still up in the air at the moment about the Bath conference. We're still waiting for the updates from the government, but we are still hoping to run, at the very least, the November conference that we've got running, Seriously Psychic at Goldsmiths University. So without further ado, I'll introduce to you CJ. So Christian Jensen Roma. CJ's lectured at various societies. He's made a living teaching students at the university for a while before an exciting career that has taken in toilet cleaning, cafetiere assistant, and singing on the dole. And I've just heard your voice this evening, CJ, so you can always break out into song.
No, we won't be doing that.
Okay. A familiar face on the UK parapsychology scene, CJ once was described as a boy racer driving the ring road of psychical research too fast, tooting his horn at the ladies. And he attempts to live up to his description. To that end, he has appeared on The Big Breakfast, The Y-Files, Ghost Adventures, and many more paranormal TV shows, including stints working for Most Haunted Live, Haunted History, and Ghost Hunters, the UK show, not the plumbing one. CJ's currently the acting secretary for ASSAP, and CJ's discussion this evening is on the theory of ghosts. So what is a ghost? In this talk, CJ will outline some of the key ideas to have come from those who study ghosts, and making a simple introduction to a very complex subject. So over to you, CJ.
Wow, that was incredibly kind of you. What an introduction, and I don't think I can possibly live up to that. So without further ado, I will do that thing which academics have done throughout history when they're embarrassed, and I will put up a PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoint presentations are the laziest and worst form of teaching. So tonight I am obviously going to use one. And if you've got questions that come up during the course of the evening, please just type them away in the window. And Mark, the laughing policeman, our sexy young man who deals with groups and NRPI, will then be able to share them with us. Right, okay, so tonight I'm going to be talking about the theory of ghosts, and I'm slightly disadvantaged in this by not being dead. A few weeks ago when I had COVID, I honestly thought I might be, but I'm still here, large and ugly as ever, and so I'm able to talk about it. And the first thing I'm going to say is ghosts exist, because I think the notion they don't is laughable. Why do I say that? Well, ghosts exist in some sense, don't they? We all know people who claim to have had an experience they define as a ghost. Ghosts might be more of a syndrome than a disease. It might be that there are a series of symptoms which lots of people recognize. It might be that underlying them, there are different causes. That some ghosts are misperceptions, some ghosts are hallucinations, some ghosts are caused by human psychic ability, and some ghosts are caused by demons, spirits, who knows? But it's not useful to just say they exist. It's not terrifyingly useful to say they don't either. What we need to do is to find out more about them, and that usually means going ghost hunting. And I've just discovered that you can move the pictures of people around the screen. I don't know if you've worked out how to do that, so you can see the pictures. I think that's Becky, who's treasurer of ASSAP on the left, and another young lady. This is why I go ghost hunting, you see. I was inspired by the film Ghostbusters and the realization that the only way I was ever going to get a girlfriend was to be... No, that's not true. There's nothing wrong with ghost hunting. Let's move on. Sorry, I am embarrassing. People spend more time trying to hunt ghosts than understand what they actually are. And you may recognize, oh, we've got 3 more people who've come in. Can somebody let them in? How do I do it? Admit all. There we go. Right. Yeah, people spend more time trying to hunt ghosts than understand what they actually are. You may notice throughout this presentation I have a bad sense of humour, but this 1969 cartoon, Scooby-Doo, actually is a pretty good model of how people hunt ghosts nowadays. They go to the location, they encounter the ghosts, they run away, they jump into the back of a van and take Scooby snacks, and they use lots of equipment when they have it, and occasionally they do some research. Quick question, which we can see if anyone can answer at the end, which is Scooby-Doo here. What does he have in common with this next villain? Christian Jensen Roma. That's me. Well, see if you can work that out. So people experience ghosts, or what they call about ghosts, but what is the thing they're experiencing? Because it really is what matters. Why does it matter? Well, firstly, what is a ghost? How does it fit into our science, our physics? If we don't understand that, we will never be able to make the paranormal scientific. There's no point in investigating it. It may as well stay part of theology or philosophy. Is a ghost a person? If we go into a haunted house and, like a certain lady used to when I was working with her, scream, you know, will you bloody show up and rah, or I'll do you? You know, she'd get quite excited of it. Anyway, should we insult ghosts and demand they perform parlour tricks? Or is it a person? Does it have rights? If a ghost is haunting your house, should it be allowed to evict you? Does the ghost really have the true rights of the tenancy? Are they legal entities? How should we relate to ghosts? Are they our friends? Are they something we can trust? What are the best ways to collect evidence of their existence to prove to people who doubt? Is a ghost, because the definition I'm using is just an experience, more than just imagination or hallucination? And what are the ways we can explore the nature of ghosts? And these are some of the questions I want to talk about tonight. But because most of those would be profoundly dull, we'll save some of them for the questions and we'll move on to the history a bit. Throughout history, most people's assumption on ghosts has been that they are dead people. And when you die, your spirit normally goes somewhere else, but in some cases, it remains here. Now, there's actually, in classical theology, there's a 3-part demarcation between soul, spirit, and body. And if you read the Pauline epistles, you'll find references to that. If you're interested in that kind of more complex issue, have a chat with me about it afterwards, or bother me at a conference, and we'll talk about it. But for the moment, the idea is you die, you carry on living, go somewhere else. See, waiting room, just letting somebody else in. Sorry, I have to do this because we can only have one host, it turned out. And so spirits have, throughout history, been an object of both fear and fascination. And here we've got a very famous spirit photograph. It's a bit like my friend Hannah, actually. I'm not sure she'll be flattered by the comparison. But anyway, it's a nice spirit photograph, that, isn't it? Let's have another go. So the notion that spirits are ghosts gave rise to a religion in the 19th century called spiritualism, and indeed another one called spiritism, based on the teachings of Allan Kardec. And spiritualists and spiritists are almost unique amongst religions in that they are evidentially based. They claim that their religion is based in empirical facts and that anyone can test them for themselves by attending seances and listening to what spiritualists have to say. Most scientists would deny that, but philosophically completely true. Okay, if spirits are ghosts, then we might expect them to be associated with certain things. If the spirits of the dead are what ghosts are, then we might expect them to be associated with the dead. And here we've got a rather romantic picture, rather sad picture of a chap weeping over his dying bride. And here we've got a far less romantic and rather gruesome picture of a young goth sitting in a graveyard. That's me at 18, in case you hadn't guessed. That was fat even then. Human remains, so graveyards. So we might expect graveyards or places where human remains have been buried but not yet found. And there's a rather grim story about that, but I'll save that for another occasion. But yeah, so we would expect hauntings to be associated with the dead, the dying, and the remains of the dead. However, and here are the villains of the piece, the Society for Psychical Research. Now, whenever you hear the SPR mentioned, that's their acronym, you're allowed to boo, okay? No, I'm joking. The SPR are the group that ASSAP left 40 years ago, and they are a wonderful psychical research society established, as the name says, in 1882. Quick advert. At the time, this was originally, if you're watching a recording or later on, then I'm afraid I can't help you. But at the time this was originally done, if you go to www.spr.ac.uk and join, it's a little bit more expensive than ASSAP, but if you're a member of ASSAP, you really do want to be in the SPR as well. They're currently doing a series of webinars who we shamelessly ripped off. I mean, whom actually quite by coincidence, and it genuinely was, they started their series at the same time we started ours. And I'm sure that theirs will be much more academic and respectable. But let's move on. In 1894, the census of hallucinations, the largest study ever to address spooks, was done by the SPR. Nothing to do with the band, they just took their name from it, but I thought the picture was pretty. The SPR census involved 40 collectors going out and interviewing 17,000 people from across Russia, America, and a large number of other places. And they were able to put together a huge amount of information about how people actually experience hauntings. One of the most interesting figures to come out of it was that 9.8% of their sample believed they had seen an apparition. So when you see the factoid that 1 in 10 people have seen a ghost, that's where it comes from. Now, attention all ladies, attention young ladies, please control yourself. Sorry, I'm just gonna let more people into the waiting room. Admit all, right? Please control yourself. Edmund Gurney is about to appear on the screen. Edmund Gurney has been described as the most beautiful man to appear in the Victorian era. He was fabulously attractive. And as a result of that, sorry, I'm just having a problem with the waiting room. The same person's trying to join 4 times. I'm just going to have to give up on that for the moment. Okay, so yeah, he was meant to be fabulously attractive. And there was one young lady, a well-known authoress of the period, who, having met him, turned around and said that he was gorgeous beyond compare and she could think of nothing else for 4 or 5 days. So let's see if I can show you a picture of him. And then, ladies, please feel free to tell me in chat how gorgeous he is. There you go. Edmund Gurney doesn't do it for me, but then I'm not that kind of girl. Still, at the end of the day, Gurney was a great scholar, a genius, an incredibly clever, wise young man, and like me, a complete waster. He failed in a large number of careers, music, medicine, law, and eventually was offered the post of secretary for the Society for Psychical Research, which he worked tirelessly for many years until his tragic death. He took a bottle of chloroform or ether, I forget which, but he drank it, ether I think, but he drank it believing it was lemonade and died in a Brighton hotel room. He was married to a young woman who was supposedly just as beautiful as him, and according to everyone who knew her, very talkative and incredibly silly, which is not a compliment. Oh well. F.W. Myers, Freddie Myers, he was according to his contemporaries, a rogue. He was a womanizer. He was a bit of a, what's the word? What's the word I want? He was everything I want to be. There you go. Unfortunately, although we lived in the same town, it was many centuries apart. Right, Phantasms of, oh, a century and a half apart. Phantasms of the Living, written by Gurney, Myers and Podmore. And why am I talking about all this in theories of ghosts? Because apart from the fact that Gurney was apparently really cute and I wanted to put a picture up of him, the SPR Census of Hallucinations found out that most ghosts whose identity was known to the recipient, to the person who saw it, or was identified subsequently, were of living persons. And this 2-volume book, Phantasms of the Living, caused a near riot in some circles because of the traditional identity of ghosts with the dead. So how could you explain it? Well, one possibility is astral projection. And it was suggested that some people were able to leave their bodies and enter the astral plane and travel elsewhere. And as a result of that, there was a series of experiments. Sorry, I'm playing around here. It's really frustrating because I'm the only host. I have to let people in and out of the waiting room. And there are some people who keep trying to join, so it just keeps coming up. Sorry. Yeah, there was a series of experiments which were written up in the early Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. And I didn't illustrate these for a reason you'll very quickly understand, which is that they involved young men attempting to astrally project into young ladies of their acquaintances' bedrooms. Now, I have never understood how or why this was considered to be ethical, but apparently in the Victorian society, astrally projecting into a woman's bedroom was not only, an unmarried young woman's bedroom, was not only considered acceptable, but laudably scientific. So if you read through the early proceedings of the SPR, there are quite a couple, there's 2 or 3 papers that refer to it. So if anyone would like to do some experiments later, yeah, you know, we could work on that. I'm sure we can come up with some. Okay, now here's the real villain of the piece, or according to certain people, he would be Sir William Barrett, founder of the Society for Psychical Research. Now, Barrett was a spiritualist. He was something of a Christian theologian. He was a scientist, and he was fascinated by telepathy, or as it was called then, thought transference. And he wrote a series of papers, one of which was published in a publication called Nature. And the editors of Nature do not tend to publish things that they think are nonsense. Right, let's just see if I can let someone in again. No, I can't. So Barrett, oh, let's go back. Back, I say. Back from which you can, I don't know. Barrett was, in fact, a champion of spiritualism, and he had the idea of forming a scientific study to investigate mediumship, a scientific society. And that society was convened as the Society of Psychical Research, and Barrett was the founder. But to make it work, he knew that Henry Sidgwick up at Cambridge University with Myers and Gurney had the social contacts, the friends, and had spent many years like him on psychical research, on testing mediums, investigating thought transference. So he came up with the idea of founding the society. And for the first 6 years, it was a rather shaky alliance of spiritualists and scientists, with the Cambridge group representing the conservatives who were not keen on spiritualism, and Sir William Barrett very firmly in the spiritualist camp. And eventually, after 1 year, he stayed a member of the society, but he left and went to America, where he founded the American Society for Psychical Research, and later went to Dublin, where he formed the Dublin Group. And in 1904, he finally got to be president of the SPR. But throughout those years, there was something of a falling out, because the early SPR debunked a whole load of fraudulent mediums. And while they were doing that, they sometimes, according to Barrett, threw out the baby with the bathwater and were more than a little unkind on spiritualists generally. In 1888, Barrett's party left the SPR and set up the London Spiritualist Alliance, which today is the Spiritualist College. Tom will know, somebody will know. But anyway, so there's a tension between Sir William and the Sidgwicks. Right, this here is from 1920s. I must say Wikipedia's bias against any mediumistic phenomena is totally frightening, but this is from the Crawford Circle. This is ectoplasm supposedly exuded from Kathleen's lady parts. And according to Wikipedia, this is definitely fraudulent. I don't know if it is or isn't, but I do know that W. Crawford Knox, who investigated it, was far from a fool. And he was a very clever young man, an engineer, and he investigated what he called psychic rods. So ectoplasm as a phenomena was physical mediumship generally, was looked upon as with great skepticism by the SPR. And I don't know why. Well, partly because of things like this. This is a famous photo purportedly of Helen Duncan. I've never heard anyone defend it. It looks fraudulent, doesn't it? Or then again, there's something just inherently creepy about it in the same way that ventriloquist dummies are. creepy, and I'm not quite sure how the trick was done, if it is a trick. Nonetheless, these are supposedly ectoplasmic beings. Now, whether Helen was fake or not, there were certainly ones who were, and many of them were caught. And they led the SPR to decide that at the end of the day, mediumship was a load of rot. William James, the great American philosopher, father of psychology, and his brother Henry James was the novelist who wrote The Turn of the Screw, that great short story, however, said, all crows are black. If we find even one crow that is white, we disprove that hypothesis, that theory. And this is called the problem of induction in philosophy, which is for science to work, the same prevailing laws have to apply at all times. So what James is actually saying is that although there are fake mediums, that doesn't mean that all mediums are. And we're still on the first theory, aren't we? Spirits of dead people. So I have no idea how much time we spent. Luckily, James encountered his white crow, and here she is, Leonora Piper. And he was convinced that Mrs. Piper, who accounts of her work, her seances with the SPR feel like many of the early proceedings are absolutely fascinating. If you do join the SPR, they have a thing called Lexion, which lets you read through all the old journals. So you're able to read all the work they did with Mrs. Piper and others. Anyway, Mrs. Piper was the white crow. So the SPR generally, although they don't have corporate opinions, was sympathetic to the idea of genuine mental mediumship, and extraordinarily cynical about the idea of physical phenomena. This becomes really important in a moment, because they then, in the census of hallucinations, notice that a lot of apparitions are of people who are alive. Now, one of W.T. Stead's most famous cases, that's actually Melvin Harris debunked it in the 1980s, but we'll just still talk about it because it's a classic that's always used to describe it. So whether or not it actually happened, Harris could find no evidence at all that it had. It's a great story anyway. Rear Admiral Sir George Tryon was in the Lebanon at Beirut commanding the British fleet, which consisted of 10 battleships, wonderful, marvellous, majestic imperial battleships of Victorian Britain. And he was a stickler for discipline, he was authoritarian, and he was regarded like a little god by his sailors. And the captains certainly obeyed his orders. And they sailed out of the harbour straight out in 2 columns, which were 1,200 feet apart, which is actually rather close. And then he gave the wonderful order that both columns should turn inwards and round and then come back on themselves. So if you imagine 2 lines going out of school children, and then they're going to turn left and walk back towards where they came, and then they would lay anchor. The problem was the turning circle of a battleship is 800 feet, and they were 1,200 feet apart. So there just wasn't enough room. So the 2 lines, 5 ships deep, sail out. He puts the order up, and one vice admiral tries to question his orders, at which point he sends a rather curt order saying, one of the captains sends an order saying, sir, we're not sure. And he just says, get on with it, basically. And a lieutenant says, sir, 1,600 or 1,200 feet. And he said, 1,200 feet. The result was that 2 British battleships, the Victoria and the Camperdown, went straight to the bottom. And being Rear Admiral Sir George Tryon, he assumed a position, taking the salute, and stayed on the bridge as the other officers around him were leaving to escape in the boats, saying, and his last words were, "It's all my fault." And he went down, and his hat floated upon the waters. If you've ever seen Kind Hearts and Coronets, that inspired that scene. According to Stead, at the same time this happened, his wife was giving a ball in Curzon Street, I believe, in London, and he appeared there with a face like deathly pallor, and she was shocked because she thought he was at the Mediterranean with his fleet. But he appeared, and she saw him for a few moments, and he said, "It's all my fault," and then she lost sight of him and never saw him again. And that was said to be a crisis apparition. Now, that's, as I said, a really questionable one. There are better examples, but the idea of a crisis apparition, in this case, he may very well have actually been dead. But what if it occurred before he died? What if he were trapped on a mountainside somewhere, and you sent a message to your wife? Or what if you appeared as one lady did to her, well, there was two men in a cabin going across the Atlantic. The wife goes in a dream to visit him. His bunkmate wakes up and says, "You're a nice kind of fellow to have a woman come visit you at night," and describes his wife. And when he gets back, she's written in her diary that she dreamt of visiting him that night. These are all, it's not exactly a crisis apparition, but the same notion. So it suggests that ghosts are what? Well, they could just be your spirit leaving your body and traveling. It could be that at the moment of death or at a moment of crisis, some part of your soul splits off and is able to go to your friends. That's how spiritualists would say it. Nonsense, says Myers. No, this cannot be. This is a form of thought transference. What is actually happening is that the mind of the victim is projecting an energy, a material, like mental radio. He didn't use that term, but it was used by Upton Sinclair many years later. So apparitions are actually telepathy. And he invented the word in 1894, telepathy, to describe them. Now, telepathy is a really funny thing, because in most cases, you expect, when you're dealing with a psychic phenomena, it to appear back in the medieval period. You expect to read about, sorcerers doing it in the past. Actually, mind reading seems to be quite a 19th century concept. Before the first magicians doing mind reading acts, you don't read many cases of it. I can't think of even an example in the Bible off the top of my head. If anyone can think of early cases of telepathy, let me know. But I think telepathy was seen as being scientific, it was seen as being possible, and it's rooted in the human organism rather than deceased spirit. So this is how he believed ghosts worked. He believed that, let's say, for example, that I'm laying in my bed with COVID and I am desperate for an ice cream, but even more, I need my pills. So I send a telepathic sending to Becky, who's next door. She lives next door to me. And she has her brain then creates a ghost. She sees an apparition of me. And so this is the notion that what is actually happening here is a telepathic sending is received by the brain. The brain has no idea what to do with it, so it creates a ghost. Now, before we go any further, we all have the capacity to hallucinate ghosts and create them. And the reason I know this is true is because I have been asleep many nights and I have found myself back in my school or back in places or met people who've been dead for years in my dreams. Dreams are like the video games of the mind, aren't they? While we're sleeping, we go into worlds that aren't real, sometimes quite surreal, and where places and times melt into one another. But that same apparatus that we use to generate our dreams can produce waking visions. Years ago, I took a bunch of young women, undergraduate students, for purely ethical reasons, of course, to investigate a haunted pub, the Dick Whittington in Gloucester. And during the course of the evening, as is always the case, they saw an apparition downstairs in the wing and attempted me to go down and see it. And I couldn't. I got there too late, or I think I actually said something like, I have been a ghost hunter for 20 years, and now you have convinced me that ghosts may actually be real and therefore probably dangerous. I've changed my opinion. I'm going to climb out of this window. Anyway, by the time they had stopped kicking me and persuaded me to come downstairs, said apparition had disappeared. But their descriptions were actually quite good. We went home anyway. And later that night, it was really funny because the owner's children came back and brought about 150 friends back who proceeded to have a banging drum and bass evening in the basement we were meant to be investigating, which is not ideal for investigative purposes. So we went home. And when I was at home, I woke up and my then girlfriend was screaming at me. And I saw what I thought was a Dutchman walking towards me through the bedroom. So I leant forwards, ripped out the lamp, hurled it at his head, and leapt up and ran towards him, bellowing. At which point it all went a bit wrong because she grabbed my leg and said, "What the hell are you doing? What the hell are you doing?" And it turned out she'd woken me up because the cat was vomiting on the duvet. That wasn't much nicer, but it turned out that my dream, which had been about this guy presumably, had somehow transposed over into waking reality. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience of a dream managing to persist through, but the same mental apparatus that we use to dream, I believe, is involved in the hallucinatory process. So if it's just hallucinations, well, no. Here, it's a real mental signal sent by somebody. Oh, sorry. Sorry, ladies. I didn't mean to overcome you with lust. Another photo of Gurney. I should have worn that. The problem with this telepathic notion is that what if multiple witnesses see it? 20% or thereabouts of the SPR sample were multiply attested, as I recall, or maybe that was the cases, you know, where the person was on their right. Yeah, 20% had more than one witness. And if more than one person sees the apparition from different positions, how can it be telepathy? Well, Gurney experimented with this idea, and he suggested that actually I received a telepathic impulse and then I pass it to my friends, or we all receive the same impulse and then it adjusts itself to our perspective. And he played around with the idea, but unfortunately his tragically young death prevented him going very far. And Freddie Myers also died quite young. He never finished his work on this problem of telepathy. The question is, we're now invoking one miracle, telepathy, to do away with another, spirits. Does it explain it any better? Well, let's carry on a bit and see where we go. Hornell Norris Hart, an objectivist in the 50s in America, wrote a very famous essay called 6 Theories of Apparitions. If you make a note of that and Google it, you can probably find it online. I'm pretty sure it's been published, and it's free to read now, but if it's not, you can certainly buy it somewhere. And 6 Theories of Apparitions. Oh, there will be a full bibliography covering all of this and the best books on ghost research from my viewpoint of theoretical work at the end. But for ghost hunters, you know, it's just stuff that you can browse through. It's not going to help you become a better ghost hunter. Well, it might do. We'll get to that in a minute. So Hornell Norris Hart came up with 6 theories, 5 of which were historical, and one of which was his etheric object hypothesis. And this is something that Myers had hinted at in one of his ideas. He'd come up with the idea that the ether, the luminiferous ether, which was actually cutting edge physics at the time and is now regarded as being nonsense. It's a kind of field that permeated everything, which allowed light to move through a vacuum. But this is very similar. The notion is that there is another state, maybe a different vibratory rate, as people might say, a different energetic state. And I have an etheric self and a physical self. Hopefully the etheric self weighs less and is a little better with the ladies. My bed, however, also has an etheric double. And what happens is that I can leave traces in the ethereal realm, which can later be seen by somebody else. So if you've ever heard of the ethereal realm and you play Dungeons and Dragons or similar, that might actually make more sense to you than my description of it. But that's another theory. George Nugent Merle Tyrrell is possibly the greatest ghost hunter who ever lived in many ways, because he wrote, well, not ghost hunter, but ghost researcher. He wrote a book called Apparitions, and it is really hard going. But what he does is GNM Tyrrell, he was always called GNM. GNM Tyrrell, remind you of something from, I've forgotten what it's called now, GRM Martin. GNM Tyrrell invented a notion of what he called the stage designer. So at Thetford Priory, when I was 18, with 4 friends, we saw an apparition descending a staircase. 5 of us saw the same apparition. I ran at it, attempted to climb the staircase, believing it was real, fell through it. Some of you have probably seen the video we made of the show we made in the 90s about it. GNM Tyrrell would say that the staircase was part of the set design, and the great eccentric scientist Celia Green and Charles McCreery from over at Oxford, who are lovely people, they came up with the idea of the metachoric reality, which is that when you see a ghost, it's not just the figure that isn't real. The whole of the backdrop is also hallucinatory. So let's just check how we're doing for time. We're doing okay. So, oh, end of slideshow. Brilliant. Okay, I've lost some of my slides. Never mind. I will just go back to talking for a while. So, what we've got so far is we've got to a situation where, can you see me, by the way? Right. Oh, bad luck. What we have to look at these different theories and we have to consider them. The next theory I would actually have suggested is retrocognition. In the 50s, in a further attempt to distance themselves from spiritualism, spirits, and the idea of ghosts as dead people, a new science was developed called parapsychology. And in fact, it begins in 1925, roughly. And at that time, physics had been so successful that pretty much all of the sciences, from anthropology, archaeology, history, were attempting to take on board numerate measures. They were attempting to be more hard science and to copy the successes of physics. And even in politics, we see something of that actually. With the was part of the appeal of Marxism was the notion that it was a scientific, methodologically studyable form of political analysis. But all of these people who jumped onto this idea were, strictly speaking, materialist, and they wanted to make science completely materialist. Now, there's a big issue here to do with philosophy of science. I'm not going to even start to go into it. You'll get me into ranting as up. One thing I'm going to say actually is that whenever I went on Wikipedia and read the word pseudoscience, I wanted to throw something at the screen, because although we're very fond of calling things pseudoscience, anyone who's studied philosophy of science, one of the first things they teach is the demarcation debate, which is, what is a science? How do you define a science? And if you limit that science to only laboratory-controlled experimental measures, then as Karl Popper himself pointed out, the theory of evolution stops being a scientific theory because it just becomes part of history, because it's something that happened once. You can't replay the tape and test it in a laboratory. Astronomy becomes a pseudoscience because you can't do experiments on the sun. You can't do experiments in the traditional sense within the laboratory on the rest of the universe. We can only observe the data and then construct hypotheses around it. So the demarcation debate is the suggestion that science has to be defined something like the definition of pornography. I can't say what it is, but I know what it is when I see it. And so whenever you talk about pseudoscience, anyone who's studied actual axioms of science will turn around and say, well, you know, what basis have you got for saying that? And then it becomes a much more complicated debate. But Wikipedia just says it's a pseudoscience. Anyway, I'm not going to get angry about that. I'm not going to get angry about stupidity for once. I'm going to move on and talk about theory of ghosts. Retrocognition came out of this new science called parapsychology. And the older psychical research in the 50s gives way to parapsychology. And parapsychology is not just a science in the objective sense of it's going to let you create new ideas about what's going on in the world, or it's not just psychical research continued. It had a whole new paradigm, which was general ESP. And ESP is the idea that human beings are psychic and have powers like telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, and potentially retrocognition. And retrocognition says that what's actually happening is not that you're seeing a dead person, but that in some way your consciousness is going into the past, retrocognition, and seeing a scene that happened in the past, or that your consciousness is going to another place and learning the facts by clairvoyance, distant vision. And then if you see a ghost, you're reconstructing the image to explain what you've seen, or you're reading somebody else who's already has read about the ghost of the monk's mind, and then you're seeing the phantom monk. Right. So throughout the 50s, Green, McCreary and others carried out studies based on the SPR census, and they discovered that crisis apparitions were still really common. And then in the 1990s, the wonderful Donald J. West carried out a series of studies, and he found out that ghosts were normally of living people. Becky, the treasurer of ASSAP, did her PhD, which she finished on Halloween 2013, recreating the sense of hallucinations in detail. And she discovered that actually there were hardly any phantasms of the living. And she suggested that inherent biases in the way that the data was collected, caused by the argument about with Barrett and the fact they didn't like physical phenomena, was why they put ghosts down to telepathy. And when I first joined the Most Haunted crew, this was a bit of a problem for me, because they would get really excited about a bed shaking, or a door, a knocking on a door, or an object moving. But I would say, but that's got nothing, what's meant to be seen here is an apparition. And they would say, yes, but this is physical phenomena. And I would think, physical phenomena. They've clearly never read a parapsychological journal, all these plebs, until I was completely convinced that they actually knew more than I ever would. And I thought back to the cases I'd investigated. And one of the splits that, all this thing might sound like completely uninteresting history, but one of the splits that came out of this theory of ghosts, which put down physical phenomena, was there was a whole load of phenomena associated with hauntings that couldn't be explained. And how did they explain it then? Well, they called it poltergeist activity. So the reason poltergeist activity is split off and becomes a different thing to hauntings and apparitions is because physical phenomena are not respectable. So we've been labeled for 140 years. We have differentiated largely between poltergeists, which move things and can interact with the physical world, and which are usually said to be associated with sexually frustrated young women. If there are any in the audience who would like to just pass their details over to Mark, I will come up with a series of empirical, and I will of course need a control, and no, this isn't going to work, ASSAP isn't going to pay for it, but never mind, ethics committees be damned, I always try these things. No, jokes aside, the reason why the emphasis was placed, I believe, on sexually frustrated young women as a cause for poltergeist phenomena may have been because the majority of psychical researchers in the 19th century were bearded elderly men. I'm not joking. I actually think that often is the case. A great book about women in spiritualism is by Alex Owen called The Darkened Room. And it looks at how spiritualism gave Victorian women who were extremely limited in their ways to do anything, a real opportunity to make an influence on the world. And Mrs. Sidgwick, who goes on, like Barrett did eventually, to become president of the SPR, Una Trowbridge, other women who really would have often had very little voice, had a voice in the SPR. Gladstone actually said that the work of the Society for Psychical Research is the most important work being conducted in the world today. Obviously, if Boris Johnson would like to say that ASSAP is the most important work being conducted in the world today, but I don't think Boris is really on the case enough to get it. So, jokes aside, we're coming up towards the end of this. What can we say? Are poltergeists the same as ghosts? That's really important. Are ghosts telepathic, or is spirits actually a better hypothesis? If spirits are a better hypothesis than telepathy, we would expect to see that the spirit was in some way related to or associated with a dead person or the remains of the dead or the actual time of death. How do we account for apparitions of the living being so common? Are they just misperceptions? Are they the fact that every girl I see looks like Emily, as somebody once said? You know, that your mental state has entered into that where you're misperceiving someone. And finally, I think where I'm going to leave this off, so we've got 10 minutes left for questions, is the hard, or however we need really, the hard problem of consciousness. So the hard problem of consciousness is a problem that science faces to this day, which is we are extraordinarily good at explaining the strong and weak nuclear forces, plasma, matter, and the material universe. We think we understand the laws of physics. But all of us, every day, experience little miracles that are hard to explain. Dream, sleep, hypnosis in particular, which was studied by the original SPR, are still great mysteries. Near-death experience, out-of-the-body experience are still mysterious today. But what's really mysterious is the fact that as you're looking now, I'm just looking at a picture of Phil Jones wearing his shades, examining Claire Davies' earrings and glancing at John Davis hasn't got a picture up. Oh, but I'm looking at Mark's glasses. Hey, Mark. I am aware of all you people, and you, in your own way, are aware of me. You're all sitting there. So, the problem of consciousness. We are all conscious and alive. Computers aren't alive. No other things that we're aware of, perhaps animals are, yeah, probably are, I would imagine, but they are. We have this weird self-awareness, this thing that looks out, the eye that is able to look out. And that consciousness has never been satisfactorily explained by science. There are three main models, which are the materialist model, which is that consciousness is an illusion, which is very popular. Susan Blackmore advocates it. And it's the notion that there is no such thing as actual consciousness. It is just when I pick up my mother's cup, she's in a home now, sadly, but I pick up my mum's cup and drink some coffee. I did not make that decision. I picked up the cup, and then my brain tricks me into believing that I did it. So we are biological robots who justify our actions subsequently. That's Susan Blackmore and Bruce Hood from Bristol University's belief. I think it's nonsense for reasons we'll go into another time. The second theory is epiphenomenalism, which is that consciousness in some mysterious way arises from physical systems. So if you have a suitably complicated computer, it could come alive and be aware of the world and start to see and feel. And finally, dualism, which is the idea that there are two types of material in the world. Idea stuff, like the thought of a unicorn, or like your consciousness, or like souls, and physical material, and that the two relate in some way or interact in some way. Interactionism, which is what, oddly enough, the spirit of Freddie Myers claimed to suggest through mediums. Anyway, this is getting a bit hard. The hard problem of consciousness is probably beyond the scope of an introductory webinar, and I've bored you all to tears. So at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Mark and we'll take some questions. Thank you so much for being patient, and I hope that all of the questions I've barely managed to touch upon we'll be able to talk about during the questions. So thank you for being so tolerant. Cheers.
Thank you, CJ. And I know I can't hear you all, but I'm going to give a round of applause. Thank you very much for that. We have got some questions, if you're able to take some questions, CJ.
Yeah, sure.
I'll read out the first one from James Padmore. Why do we need to class poltergeist as different to ghost phenomena when apparitions are often cited as components of poltergeist phenomena?
Yeah, I used the term poltergeist from the mid-90s onwards because I was doing a case in Cirencester where there was a little boy who had been seen by a number of people. He was dressed, they described him as appearing in a Just William type dress. And they did, when I looked at the pictures, they meant a little school cap. And while we were there was all manner of physical interaction. All manner of objects were being thrown around. And in fact, it was ridiculously over the top. And I was convinced originally we were being hoaxed, but no. So yeah, I developed the term poltergeist because I began to doubt. But the reason I doubted was, well, there's a certain hard body of evidence which is poltergeist phenomena, and there's a hard body of evidence for pure apparitions. The problem you had with the early SPR and with psychical researchers ever since is they've been unwilling to accept most physical phenomena. So they've put this emphasis on mental telepathy, and telepathy has become something of a dogma amongst psi researchers. If it's not psychic powers, if it's not telepathy that's manufacturing the ghost, that suggests that ghosts are physical in some way. Now, if they are telepathic, which is what Tyrrell, Myers, Gurney, Hornell, Hart, and most psi researchers have always suggested, by definition, you cannot photograph them because they are a mental idea that is sent from one mind to another mind. They are pure information, and the actual apparition is generated internally within the brain. Yeah, so therefore you can't measure them. They won't have EMF, and there's no way we can interact with them. So the only way we'll understand them is to study the brain waves. Now, there are attempts with very, very, to my mind, I mean, one of the problems in psi research is I always refused. I didn't want anything to do with the psychic spying programs, remote viewing and all that stuff. I just didn't want to get involved. Because if there is such a thing as mental powers, psi powers, you imagine how horrific it would be if certain politicians had control of that. I'd probably be tempted to just say, yeah. Now, EMF is fascinating. As a way, EMF meters are fantastic for knowing where wires are in your wall and not electrocuting yourself. Let's look at EVP. That's interesting because perhaps some kind of Gauss fluctuation could record directly onto the recording. I don't know. You see, I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not a mechanic. I don't know this. I don't know the science behind this stuff. You need to talk to an electrician, not to a psi researcher, to understand what might be going on there. But generally speaking, if ghosts are telepathic, there will be no real ghost photos. So if we have one ghost photo that is real, that is our white crow. Sorry, anyway, next question, sorry.
So yeah, I think you've gone on to the next question. That was from Alan. How do we explain changes in EMF when ghost hunters often measure, which ghost hunters often measure? I
remember when Phil was on Most Haunted, me desperately texting him because he kept picking up a rapidly cycling EMF fluctuation, and I pointed out that he was standing by the back of a fridge. He was on live TV, and I was the researcher at the time, but I was sitting in a hotel room just texting him. One other case, when we were at Derby Jail, we had a chap who had his EMF meter out, and he had his mobile phone in his top left pocket. And he suddenly realised that the signal would become greater as he brought his EMF meter closer to his body, until it was one of the women who was with him said, "It's trying to enter into you. It's gone into you." And he thought he was possessed, at which point I went over and took his phone out of his pocket, and he was much relieved and felt a little bit silly. The greatest moment at Derby Jail, though, was when one team had set up an infrared lamp and an infrared camera, and of course no one could see the lamp. It was pitch black. And as we were walking down the corridor, I kept nearly walking into this really expensive bit of kit. And this woman walked past me and went walking down the corridor straight towards the infrared lamp. So I was able to shout, "Don't go into the light! Whatever you do, don't walk into the light." Sorry, you have to have seen Poltergeist to get that one. But anyway, jokes aside, EMF, well, if ghosts are emitting photons, so they're physical enough to appear on camera, yeah, maybe they're projecting some kind of electromagnetic field, and we need physicists and electricians to look at that. My friend Bruce built the condom. I forgot what the acronym stood for, but it was wonderful, which was a Pringle tube with a very primitive, essentially a theremin in it. And as you moved your hand towards it, if anyone walked by it, it played a tone which increased in frequency. So you could play it to make woo woo noises by putting your hand near and close and away. And what we'd do is, when we did a case, while we were interviewing people, we'd set it up on the table, and it had wires coming out of it and various diodes and things that flashed. Didn't do anything at all, apart from make a noise, but we'd get the family to play with it. So they were all keeping very calm and steady in one place while somebody did the interviews and somebody mapped the house and took the measurements. That was just a really useful bit of kit. No? You look cynical, but anyway, next question.
Okay, so I'm going to read the next question from Beth. Hi, Beth. What's CJ's thoughts on residual hauntings with non-living objects that are observed?
Sure.
A chair, a person is sitting on, or a carriage, a horse, a person are using?
Sure. So Tyrrell, GNM Tyrrell, won't go back to the picture. He came up with an explanation for this. He said that you can't have a headless horseman without having the horse underneath it. And so therefore the brain generates the horse, which has no spirit, as being a set dressing for the performance of you seeing the ghost. I was never convinced by it. There's stories about a phantom double-decker bus in London, aren't there? I've always thought that'd be something we could investigate. There are stories about phantom tube trains. There are all kinds of phantom objects throughout history. But when it comes to headless horsemen, though, the best story I ever heard was during the execution of Anne Boleyn. The headsman was riding into town, and it's a hot day, and he was really tired, so he stopped to have a beer at the Old Queen. And while he was drinking his beer down, a wasp came along and stung his horse on the bum, and the horse went flying off down the road. So he ran down the road, waving his axe. Actually, it was a sword, but it doesn't matter. The historical accuracy doesn't come into this. Chasing it down the road, waving his axe above his head and shouting, "Come back, come back." And that's why to this day, that road is haunted by a horseless headsman. Sorry, that was shit. Okay, bad jokes, move on. Next question.
Okay, I just want to say, Andy Wilson, just behind you. Okay, so there's a follow-up question from James.
Hang on, the best psychical research documentary of all time doesn't feature me. It's The Muppets Christmas Carol. Watch it, it's brilliant. Okay. I love that film.
I'm writing it down now.
Yeah, carry on, sorry, you were saying.
Okay, so there was a follow-up question from James. If ghost phenomena are potentially only telepathic, how do we explain some of the compelling audio-visual evidence?
Well, is it compelling? Is it really compelling? I worked in paranormal TV for 20 odd years, and I can't watch it without taking diazepam. I mean, I start to shake. No, jokes aside. I mean, have we actually really got much compelling evidence so far? I don't know. I would like to think we have. I'd like to think that ghost hunters have recorded a lot of data. The problem is that they haven't actually made it available to enough people. Maybe ASSAP should create a clearinghouse by which we start looking at some of that data, and we start finding, you know, measurable quantitative data. And there are ways you can use quantitative measures to investigate a haunted house. Gertrude Schmeidler in 1966 wrote a paper called a quantitative assessment of a haunted house. And that's a really interesting paper which involves using psychics, but in a mathematically determined way with a scoring regime, so you can actually tell if they're psychic or not, and look for your ghosts at the same time. Maybe I should talk about that another time because it's a great paper. But anyway, that was ASPR, Gertrude Schmeidler, a quantitative assessment of a haunted house. Have a look at public parapsychology's papers on apparitions as well. They're on the web and they're really good. Okay, apart from on temperature, I'm still not.
Okay, CJ, I'm going to ask this question because I was present when you did a talk at the Arno Feeney, I think it was a couple of years ago now, but this one's about time slips. So how do time slips occur? Is this haunting or is this something else? What's your view?
Well, time slips seem to cluster in certain spaces. There's some of them, like the famous one, I've forgotten the town, is it Ryde or Ventnor? The one right in the middle of the Isle of Wight, Lucy Lightfoot, is actually a Victorian myth. The Liverpool time slips, I'm quite fascinated by them, but unfortunately they come down very often to the word of Tom Slemen, who's a great entertainer, a raconteur, and a wonderful guy, but I'm not sure that I believe a word of it. So, but yeah, there are all kinds of stories where people seem to have temporarily gone back into the past. One of those that I've personally investigated was the Kersey time slip that happened to 3 sailors in the 50s after they went to a village called Kersey and thought they'd encountered something out of the Middle Ages. Now, Kersey is in Suffolk, and what I will say is that if I went to Kersey nowadays, if you went to Kersey, you'd think you'd encountered something from the Middle Ages. It's that kind of a place, and I'm not saying the locals are backward because I'm a Suffolk lad and I come from there, but you understand what I mean. So, retrocognition, the idea that our consciousness can move back into through time, from a physicist's viewpoint, is far less problematic than the idea that we can see into the future. It's theoretically possible. I mean, in fact, there are ways you could do it, but they would involve taking up huge amounts of mass and vast amounts of energy and reforming the solar system to, what's it called? Tipler's idea. Look up Frank Tipler plus time machine. There are models to do it, but they're not practical. Anyway, let's move on. Next.
Okay, so I think this is probably going to be our final question. This is from Robert Moore. In your view, have there been any convincing apparitions from the future?
We can do a couple more if anyone's got any questions, because I'm not in a hurry, but yeah. There's a couple of interesting ones where people have seen strange vehicles, etc., and subsequently the road has been generated. But yeah, because as James has just said, you see, if you're seeing a future ghost and you're interacting with it, then the percipient from the future is actually carrying out retrocognition and seeing into their past. I'll tell you a quick story then. Yeah, the German observation from The Unexplained. That's the one I was thinking of, Robert. The Unexplained was a part work put together by Peter Brooksmith in the 1980s as a series of magazines, and you sometimes can find the whole lot on the internet or in secondhand bookshops. If you ever get the chance, buy them. They're excellent. There were 13 volumes. They're very good, even though they're now 40 years out of date. A quick story, and we'll call it a day on this so I don't bore everyone to death. When I was a young hippie, I used to have long blonde hair and wear flowers in my hair and flowers painted on my jeans, tie-dye shirts, and very rarely go to school. But no, I was in the 6th form, and my friends Hugh and I had gone out for lunch, and we'd gone down to Whiting Street in Bury to buy some tuna crunch sandwiches. It's not a very interesting detail, but I thought I'd throw it in there. You know, this is how you tell a story. You add absolutely irrelevant facts to make people buy into it. Realism, yeah. And then subsequently, it turns out the whole story's bollocks. But no, in this case, I walked down the side of the Abbey Church in Bury, the cathedral. And as I walked down the side of it, I saw a what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, Goddard's ghost story. I'll come back to that in a minute. Yeah. I saw a bunch of school kids in St James Middle School close coming towards me. And it was a hot day, and he had wandered off to buy some cigarettes or something. I don't know what he was doing. And I felt really sick and really strange. And then I saw myself as a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old in the school, amongst the school kids walking towards me. And I recognized them as my classmates. And I thought, I'm looking into the past. I'm seeing myself as I was. And all I knew about doppelgangers was that they were a symbol of death, and they meant that you were about to die. And if you go to my blog and look up The Mystery of the Doppelganger or How I Defeated the Evil Death Omen, you will discover the answer. But actually, I'll tell it here, which is I got back to school, was violently sick, felt absolutely awful, was sent home, and for the next 3 days had to have the doctor out who said, oh, he's got a severe migraine. Well, I'd never had a migraine. I had something called a hemiplegic migraine. I think that's how you say it. I've had 3 of them in my entire life. And whenever I have them, I have weird visuals and I have a sense of disturbance and I have no idea at all what's going on. And it turns out that one really unusual but genuine thing from the medical literature on hallucinations is a relationship between the onset of migraine and hallucinations of yourself. But the overwhelming terror I had, and strangely, I never watched Doctor Who because it always frightened me too much. My sofa was just not big enough for someone as fat as me, or clearly to hide behind. But the thing that really, really frightened me was the notion that if I'd seen myself at 10 as the complete hippie drongo I was at 18, I would probably have jumped in front of a bus because I was everything that I, as a young perfectionist child, despised. I was absolutely what, I would never have grown up into. And that just made me think of it, this notion of, the guy seeing into the future, seeing into the past. And therefore, I would have killed myself, I would have leapt in front of a bus to make sure I did not become a bloody hippie. So...
that's very harsh. And teenage genes and hormones do change you, don't you? And how do you know you weren't looking into a parallel past?
Well, maybe. But... I grew up to be okay-ish, I guess. Shame the hair fell out. So last thing, somebody asked about Goddard's flight. He flew over Monroe, was it? And recently somebody has argued that he claimed that he'd seen a load of monoplanes down below, which were yellow, while making a flight. And at that time, they were not the standard training planes that they were later on in the history of the RAF. So he saw some planes that a few years later he recognised. But somebody pointed out that there was actually a working airbase, not where he was, but within like 12 or 15 miles of it, which actually might very, very well have had yellow aircraft at the time. And that Goddard may have been mistaken about where he was and seen a working airfield, but believed he was over the disused one because he might not have been aware of the working airfield, possibly because it was secret. But anyway, the whole story is available online. It's a classic case. And I think that Dr. Peter McHugh might know a lot more about it than I ever will. So maybe you should ask him. Okay.
Good. Fantastic. Just take a breath. Fantastic. Loads of information there. Some stuff that I've made some notes and I'm going to be looking at myself. And I think one of the questions was, is it going to be going out online? Yes, it is. I'll have to go back to Nori, who is our events manager, is it going out on Facebook, CJ? Was it?
I don't care.
Certainly, it'll be on YouTube. I think.
I have embarrassed myself in much worse places, so it was just
be a link.
But at the end of the day, 3 things to take away. 1, join ASSAP if you're not a member. It's a good place to be, and we're going to be doing these weekly. Is that right, Nori?
Yeah. So the next one is actually the 25th of June. Robert Moore's going to be talking about Adamski and the British UFO movement. So that's the next one to look forward to. Excellent. So same time, same place next week.
Second thing, join the SPR because they are not our enemies. Boo. They are not our enemies. They're great people, and they're also doing a series of webinars on a different night. And I think if you do go on, you'll learn lots and lots and lots. And the third thing is question everything. And this telepathic notion and the whole parapsychological thing, I think we need to stop thinking of poltergeists and ghosts and hauntings as being distinct and think of them as being on a continuum with the symptoms at different areas of the syndrome. So there's a long line. At one end, you've got nearly all physical phenomena, and at the other end, you've got nearly all apparitional phenomena, but almost all cases are mixed. And Gould and Cornell, in their magisterial study in 1979, found that there was a mixed group. So I would encourage you to stop worrying too much about what you're taught by experts and make it up as you go along and ask lots of questions and have fun.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, CJ.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and stay safe, as they say.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Sorry to be a pain and witter on. Good night.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Good night, everyone. Hello. Oh, hi, Alan. Well, that was tiring, and I'm not sure if anyone was particularly excited by it, but at least I got to talk for a while, which is always fun.
Okay, there's still some people with us at the moment, so
I enjoyed that. It was good fun.
yeah.
I don't get to witter enough, do I, normally?
Do you want me to answer that?
Oh, I witter during committee meetings.
Yeah.
Becky was quite pleased not to be here tonight because she said she didn't have to listen to me. Wonder if I could do anything with my hair.
You could do like me, CJ, just, give up the ghost, if you pardon the pun.
I really should. Well, thank you to everyone who came along tonight. I'm going to leave you with Mark now because I really need to, well, I'll leave it on, but I need to pop to the loo. So
okay.
I just need to work out also how to stop the recording if I can. Oh, there we go.